Dead Space 2 was developed by Visceral Games and published by Electronic Arts, EA. And this game, which came out around 3 years after the original Dead Space, is a direct follow-up and continues the story of Isaac Clarke as he tries to overcome the mental trauma of what happened aboard the USG Ishimura, which was the setting of the first game. And Dead Space 2 takes place on the space station, the civilian space station known as the Sprawl, which is located on the fictional Saturn moon known as Titan. When it comes to Dead Space 2, I am actually a very big fan of this game. Played through it numerous times, and while I like Dead Space 2 a lot, after playing through it so many times, I realized that it does have some setbacks. Overall, I believe that Dead Space 2 is an improvement. It's an overall improvement over Dead Space 1 for a variety of different reasons. But before I go into what the pros are with Dead Space 2, I want to start with what the cons are. To begin, I want to start by talking about what they actually did to the enemies, the Necromorphs. The Necromorphs in Dead Space 2 have been designed slightly different from Dead Space 1. And that's because Dead Space 2, as a whole, when it comes to the game's combat system, it's much faster than Dead Space 1. The pacing of it is much more rapid. By comparison, the enemies in Dead Space 2 move much faster than they do in the original game. In some ways, this is rather annoying and it's not necessarily fun. There are certain Necromorphs that have been designed to where it's like, okay, yeah, they move faster, but they don't break the game. And then you have other enemy types where they move faster and they move so fast that you can't really react in time to really anything that they do on screen. The one particular enemy type that I'm talking about that comes to mind would be the Scorpion Necromorph. And that enemy type is known as the Leaper. The Leaper was in Dead Space 1, but it was much slower than what you have in subsequent titles. That particular enemy type is just straight up broken in Dead Space 2. And it's one of the most frustrating enemy types that's in the game. But it's not all bad. You do have enemy types, some new enemy types that were added that I think are great additions and actually fit in the whole pantheon of the Necromorphs as far as like their mythology. And they're very fun to actually face on screen. And some of the enemy types that I'm talking about, primarily the newest one that's my favorite in this game, that's introduced in Dead Space 2 is the Stalker, which I believe is a female necromorph that hides behind different obstacles in the environment that'll basically dash out from whatever obstacle in the environment that it's hiding behind and will bum rush you. And you basically have to lie down traps in order to catch them in their tracks as they're attacking. Like I said, some of the enemies that were brought back from Dead Space 1, they weren't designed as well as they were in the original game, and that's because the pacing of Dead Space 2 is much faster than Dead Space 1. But then you have certain enemy types that were added to Dead Space 2, like the Stalker, that actually offer a good deal of challenge without being too frustrating and just beating the player over the head with nonsense. Something that absolutely doesn't work, though, is close-range combat. The combat system, as far as, if an enemy is right up in your face, that's something that really didn't work with Dead Space 1, and ironically, it doesn't work in Dead Space 2 either. Primarily because what happens is, usually if an enemy is able to reach Isaac, which is very easy for them to do in this game, once again because everything has been sped up. If an enemy becomes within close proximity of you, there's really not much you can do, usually because what happens is that another enemy will take the opportunity and also rush you and back you into a corner, and then you'll have two enemies that are on your ass, and then a third enemy will come out in the background somewhere, and then the fourth enemy will come crash through the ceiling or something and also pounce on you, and then you just become overwhelmed, and there's absolutely nothing you can do, and then the game just hands you a game over. So that's usually what happens when you encounter enemies at close range in this game, and it happened quite a few times during my playthrough, and I played this on PC once again for this retrospective. And yeah, I did not enjoy this game at all when it came to certain combat scenarios, because for whatever reason, Visceral Games decided to take Dead Space in a much more action-oriented direction with the combat system compared to the first game. It works in certain areas. It especially works when there's like certain set pieces that are happening that take place that are scripted, and the game is immensely enjoyable when those sequences do take place. But when it comes to just the core combat system, if you're surrounded by enemies and you're just backed into a corner, there's nothing you can do. Absolutely nothing. Even if you have a suit that's upgraded, and you have your health upgraded, you have armor upgraded, and for whatever reason with the PC version of this game, due to some kind of strange anomaly, I was able to have access to all the major suits that's in this game, and the weapons as well, with upgraded versions of those items. And I'm not sure exactly why that is. Maybe it's because this is the PC version, and that's why I was able to have access to those things. I'm not exactly sure, but either way, it really didn't change the outcome of close quarters combat, simply because I was playing on a higher difficulty in the first place. So another thing that's wrong with Dead Space 2 is that certain weapons that's in the game can backfire on you as the player, and not in a good way. Well, of course not in a good way. Specifically, the weapon that comes to mind would be the Detonator. The Detonator is my favorite weapon in Dead Space 2. It's a weapon where you can lay down a trap, and as an enemy passes by the detonator, it automatically will go off, and basically it'll conduct splash damage. And with most enemies in the game, that will at least blow a limb off, because it produces a trip laser. If they run into the trip laser and trip the mine that is fired, then, that's basically all she wrote. Another great thing about the Detonator is that you can attach these trip mines to walls. They stick to walls. And you can really use this weapon to great strategic effect as the player. The problem with the Detonator, though, is that Isaac can run into the trip mines and take damage. And if you run into one of the trip mines, unless your health is upgraded a great deal, you are going to die. And you are going to start from the checkpoint. And this can be extremely aggravating and frustrating to the extreme. I think they should have accommodated for certain weapons in this game to not have a high-risk approach. I'm not really a big fan of that in video games, where your own weapon can backfire and turn on you, especially if it's something that happens by accident. And because this is a survival horror game where your movement is limited and you can only move so fast, and it's also an action survival horror game, so enemies move pretty quickly on screen, and there's numerous enemies on screen at once at several points throughout this game's runtime. I just think that a weapon like the Detonator would have been better served if it was developed to not be a high risk weapon in the player's inventory. Another problem that I noticed is that the weapon switching mechanic still suffers from a delay on screen. So when you're switching weapons in this game, Visceral Games, again, for whatever reason, did not fix the speed, the actual speed of, how you switch your weapons. If you want to switch from, say, the plasma cutter to the line gun, regardless of where those items are located in the actual pop-up menu, for your inventory slots, Isaac will take the same amount of time to switch to a different weapon, and regardless if he's surrounded by enemies or not. So if you're in the dead heat of combat and you want to switch your weapon, you'll probably notice that there will be a delay on screen, and sometimes that can get you severely injured or just straight up killed. And once again, you would have to start from the checkpoint. Again, obviously this is something that was clearly carried over from the first game, and it was not addressed for the sequel. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe they overlooked it. Maybe they figured it wasn't really a problem, and maybe it's something that they developed intentionally. But just speaking personally for myself, it's something that I really wanted to see an improvement upon, and they did not fix that at all. Another issue with Dead Space 2 is the enemy placement, specifically in the latter chapters of the game. The enemy placement in Dead Space 2 was just god-awful in the later chapters of the game. And the reason this is an issue is because consistently the game will place enemies in spots that really doesn't make any sense. And Visceral Games just got lazy and said, fuck it, we're just going to throw, whatever random enemies that we feel like at the player. And they should be equipped by this point late in the game to deal with, whatever is on screen. And while that's the case, it may take some trial and error to get through some of the later combat scenarios that the game throws at you. And the reason is because of the terrible enemy placement. So that's something that's always bothered me about Dead Space 2. And I remember the first time I played Dead Space 2, and I didn't know where anything was. It was my first time playing through the game. I did not know the levels inside and out. I didn't know the Necromorphs as far as like where they were placed in the environment and what types. And the first time I played this, I grew immensely frustrated about halfway through, leading all the way through to the end of the game. And the enemy placement is basically the primary reason as to why that is. And this feeds into the last major issue that I have with Dead Space 2. The final 3 chapters of this game are fucking terrible. And that's chapters 13, 14, and 15. Chapters 13, 14, and 15 are just frustrating. They're not fun at all. They're extremely aggravating. There's something that, and I feel like there's something that should have been more properly looked after in their development. And that's rather unfortunate because, the game has this crescendo effect where, the tension is rising. You're supposed to be rooting for Isaac. And yet I just find myself just aggravated and annoyed that I have to deal with, all these bad design choices that Visceral Games made. And once again, that goes back to piss poor enemy placement. It's especially terrible during the last 3 chapters of the game, and it's just awful. Outside of those 6 flaws, Dead Space 2 overall is a huge improvement over Dead Space 1 in just about every area imaginable. For one, when it comes to the movement, Isaac moves far more fluid than he did in the first game. The controls are much more responsive, and it feels like you have more grounded control over, what you're actually doing, regardless of the actions that the character takes on screen. Kinesis is more effective in its base form compared to, what it was in the first game. It's one of the things that, as I just mentioned, has been improved to the point where it's more responsive and it's more accurate when you use the kinesis. It feels like you have more control over where you're aiming, and it's not as stiff as it was in the first game. The plasma cutter. The plasma cutter is greatly improved, once again with more fluid response. It has a better, sharper rate of fire. It has stronger firepower, and it has a shorter reload animation compared to the first game, which was just unnecessarily dragged out. The plasma cutter remains my second favorite weapon in the game after the detonator. It's extremely useful, and that's a good thing because it's the default weapon that Isaac uses, and it's the first weapon that you get in the game. So they did a great job with the plasma cutter in Dead Space 2. Another huge improvement are the suits that you get throughout the game. The suits in Dead Space 1, while they were there and the customization was there wasn't really a difference or a major difference with the suits. Basically, there wasn't several suits that was in Dead Space 1. It was basically just the same suit that you could upgrade, and there wasn't much in terms of aesthetic as far as that goes because it was the same suit. In Dead Space 2, you get multiple suits in the game, including the security suit, and the advanced suit that's actually on the cover art, and the suit that Isaac is shown to be wearing in the promotional material for Dead Space 2. The suits are more varied this time around in their aesthetic, and they're much improved when it comes to functionality. When it comes to inventory slots and armor, the suits do their job. And the farther you go in the game, once you reach the later levels of the game, you gain access to suits that are wildly different and more varied than the last one that you got. The game definitely encourages the player to experiment and to use all of the suits in the game at least once. And again, this is something that was a great design choice. And if you play the PC version, as I did, you gain access to different variations of all the major suits that's in the game right from the start. This is something that I believe is not available in the console version of Dead Space 2. Now, while the Zero-G minigames from Dead Space 1 do not make a return at all in any way, shape, or form in Dead Space 2, Zero-G itself has been revamped. It's been completely revamped in Dead Space 2, and it's a lot more fun compared to the way Zero-G was designed in the first game. And the reason for this is that Zero-G in this game has more of an emphasis on flight and 360-degree movement. So instead of just jumping from point to point to point in the environment, point A to point B to point C, so on and so forth, instead in this game, you can actually fly. You can fly around in this game in Zero-G, and that's a huge improvement over the first game. It speeds up the Zero-G segments, but it also gave Visceral Games the opportunity to do something different with the level design and create moments in the game that aren't as linear. The Zero-G sections are pretty non-linear, and that's because you have a wider range of space to interact with, which is something that wasn't really in the first games. So in my opinion, it's a much appreciated addition. And along with the Zero-G moments in the game, you have Zero-G set pieces, and I call these moments free-falling. Now, you're not always, quote-unquote, free-falling per se, but there are moments like that where, Isaac will be flying in the environment, and you're moving at a very quick pace. The similarity that I would draw to this would be the free-falling moments in God of War 3. It's basically the same exact thing. And they found a great way to implement that idea for Dead Space 2, and it works. It probably works a lot more than it should, but those free-falling moments in Zero-G are some of the most entertaining moments in Dead Space 2, because they give the game a more Hollywood blockbuster tone. The new weapons such as the Seeker Rifle, the Detonator, the Javelin Gun, and the Rivet Gun each open up new opportunities for experimentation. The gameplay in regards to the combat is much more non-linear than what you have in Dead Space 1. And that's because the weapons that are in the game, they vary differently from each other. They can be used in a multitude of different ways. And certain enemies, respond differently depending on the weapon that you're using. Certain weapons are better suited for different situations. But realistically, the game places an emphasis on player choice, and you can use really any set of 4 weapons against really any Necromorph type in any given combat scenario. And when it comes to the freedom of player choice, that's something that I'm always a fan of when it comes to gaming. Another improvement with Dead Space 2 is that older returning weapons are significantly improved over the original game. Specifically, the Ripper. The Ripper is a lot better. It's a hell of a lot better in this game than it is in Dead Space 1. In Dead Space 1, the Ripper sucked ass. It was just bad. It was just terrible the way that weapon was designed in that game. A complete joke. Whereas in Dead Space 2, the Ripper is actually useful. So they did make improvements with the weapons, not to mention what they did with the plasma cutter, which I already spoke about. So they did improve the older returning weapons in the game. As far as minigames go, there's not much here that they placed an emphasis on as far as minigames. Minigames, for the most part, are absent, and instead they've really been replaced with set pieces. such as small moments in gameplay where, Isaac will encounter a glass window in certain rooms, and if you shoot the window, then the window will shatter, and the enemies on screen will be sucked into the vacuum of space, and then you have a certain short period of time to fire at a red marker that's located above the window to activate the shutter, which will block the open space and save Isaac's ass. And that happens a few times throughout the game. So it's fun when those moments happen. Although those aren't really technically mini games, I don't consider those to be mini games. Those are more or less, once again, set pieces. But you do have the one mini game where you hack terminals here and there throughout the game. It's something that's very simple and easy to pull off. And moments like that, while they don't happen too often, when they do happen, you do feel more like an actual engineer, which is what Isaac is supposed to be. I think they did a good job with those moments. Another thing I really love about Dead Space 2, and this is actually my favorite part of this game, is the inclusion of the USG Ishimura from Dead Space 1. This provides a great nostalgic moment for those who played the first game and remember the first game at, all the different areas of the ship. And you revisit quite a few different areas from the first game when the USG Ishimura does pop up. I think that was a really good idea to connect the first game and the second by literally reusing different environments from the first game, but just reintroducing them in a different way compared to, what Visceral did with the first game. So that was a great idea. That's something you really don't see too often in video games. The Sprawl itself is a realized space station. It appears in the form of a city, and it has interesting lore and splendid art direction. The art direction in Dead Space 2 is one of my favorite aspects about it. I think it's one of the best aspects about it. And you do have unique moments throughout the game where Isaac will come across a backdrop where he can see more of the Sprawl, in the far distance. And it really does look like an actual space station, like a realistic, believable civilian station that's located in space, but appears in the form of a city. I think they did a great job with that, and it improves the game a great deal when you actually have an interest in the environment that you're playing in. And so the Sprawl was a great addition to Dead Space 2 because similar to the USG Ishimura, the Sprawl is a character within of itself. Again, that's something they really did a good job with. Now, some of the new Necromorph types are great additions to the original game's list of monstrosities. I already spoke about the Stalker. They have another Necromorph type that fires like acid at you. And if you shoot at its body, it breaks apart and it just dissolves into a big pool of acid. And if these Necromorphs hit you, they basically slow you down. And so that's something that is different. Not something you really see a whole lot in survival horror games. So I do enjoy some of the few new enemy types that they put into this game. Unfortunately, they brought back some of the stronger Necromorph types, such as the powered, darkened versions of the slashers, which is an enemy type that I really didn't care for in the first game, and they're just made worse in Dead Space 2 because they can move so fucking fast that you really can't aim at them without missing. There are some drawbacks with the Necromorphs in this game, but overall, I do like the additions. Another new enemy type would be like the child Necromorphs, children who were turned into Necromorphs. And they appear in packs, and you can take them out with one hit. But if you let them gang up on you, you're pretty much finished. So you have to be vigilant when they do appear on screen. But yeah, that's another enemy type that I had a lot of fun with. Overall, the Necromorphs are a huge improvement in this game. They're much more varied than they were in the original. As far as new characters go, the new characters aren't really that interesting, especially considering most of them die rather quickly, and they all have limited screen time. The major characters that were added include Strauss and the character Ellie. I've never really cared about the Strauss character, simply because he's just a madman. basically someone who's mentally ill who loses his mind slowly over the course of the game until Isaac is forced to basically kill him. But on the other hand, the character Ellie is a character that I really do like, mainly because she's just not a typical female video game character. She's someone who can really hold her own. And Ellie really isn't a badass character. She's not meant to be like a femme fatale. She more or less is just someone who is fighting for her life, and she's a hardened survivor like Isaac. And you can tell that there is like a romantic undertone between the two, specifically at the end of the game when Isaac decides to sacrifice himself to save Ellie. But then she returns for him at the very end of the game, which leads into a nice little zero-G freefall set piece that leads into the credits. And I'm glad that they didn't really, focus on the romantic aspect between these two characters, especially considering the fact that the Nicole character does make a return here in the form of a mental projection in Isaac's mind, because the marker has basically fucked his head up. So overall, I think Ellie is the best character in Dead Space 2. And I also really appreciate the fact that they gave Isaac Clarke a voice. Isaac Clarke in the original Dead Space was just a silent protagonist, and he basically was emotionless throughout the entire game as a result. And I'm glad that, we can finally hear what he sounds like. And Isaac in this game is hardened. He makes it clear that he already has experience dealing with the Necromorphs. And this time, it really does feel like he knows what he's doing in comparison to the first game. So I really like these characters. There's some pretty good dialogue that's in this game. The voice acting is quality. It's top notch. And there is an intriguing backstory with some of the newer characters, particularly with Ellie. And I think overall they did a great job with the story, which is actually pretty simple, because pretty much from chapter 5 or 6 all the way leading to the end of the game, Isaac's goal is to find a marker that he created and basically destroy it, because the marker creates the Necromorphs. That's basically the majority of what the game is about. And the final thing that I notice is a huge improvement with Dead Space 2 over the first game are the graphics. Graphically, this game is far superior to the original. There's greater detail on the character models and in the environment. And when I'm talking about small things in the environment, I'm talking like you'll enter into a space vacuum and you'll see small droplets of water exiting a pipe into the grand abyss that is outer space. And so you'll see these droplets of water just floating in the air, and it looks phenomenal, even to this day. At this point, obviously, Dead Space 2 is graphically outdated by today's standards, but you can still, even now, appreciate the small details that Visceral Games inserted into this back in 2011. So overall, Dead Space 2 is a great game. I don't particularly think that it overall is better than Dead Space 1, mainly because of the few drawbacks that I mentioned earlier. Gameplay-wise, obviously, it's an overall improvement, but overall, I think Dead Space 1 just has a better pace to it. The first game has a much more consistent tone as far as the combat system and all that goes. Like I said, this is not a bad game at all. It's a great sequel. It's a worthy sequel to the first game. And even with some of the drawbacks, like the last 3 chapters of the game and some questionable enemy placement later in the game, this remains one of my favorite games of all time. They did a great job with Dead Space 2. Now, I've somewhat extended the list of 7th-gen retrospectives to around 25. I hope to get to all 25 games, but there's 2 games in particular that are pretty long. All of the games on the list are around 15 hours or less, except for 2. And I'm trying to work my way through one of the longer ones right now. That's really what's on the agenda at the moment.